Welcome to the Powers Company. Panic is not a strategy, part 2 of a 3-part series. We'll be beginning in just a few minutes. Thank you for joining. Again, we want to welcome everyone to the Powers Company, part 2 of Panic is not a strategy. And this is part 2, and we'll be starting in just a few minutes. Thank you.
we're going to be focused on is our how to maximize our top 5 performance skills to maximize our employees' performance, right?
Yep.
So throughout the course of this session, I think you're going to learn strategically about accountability, ownership, and some other topics as we go through. So again, I'm Sean Hart, managing partner at the Powers Company.
I'm Dante Vaughn, Vice President with the Powers Company.
So let's just go ahead and jump in and start talking about the top 5 learning objectives, or let's talk about the learning objectives,
Sure.
and then we'll move into the skills.
Sure. So as Sean shared, it's all about helping our leaders exceed, especially in this coronavirus era. What are those top supervisory skills you need to maximize employee performance? When we talk about those skills, we want to look at it from how do supervisors respond to the demands in the workplace today, because it looks very different than maybe a few months ago. We're also going to talk about how to establish that sense and culture of ownership and accountability for performance. That is imperative because all of our leaders have been pushed to rise up in their roles and take on new areas of the business or operation, or simply new demands that they've never faced before. So we'll explore those principles. We're also going to talk about, in the midst of all of the social distancing that's going on, isolation protocols, how do we maintain a team-centric culture? That's really important, especially now. And then we'll wrap up with some best practices regarding how to foster that sense of ownership and accountability, urgency and tenacity with frontline leaders. What does that look like? Urgency and tenacity. So we'll put some definition and some best practices around that.
Excellent.
Sounds good? Let's get started.
So I think the first thing we should talk about is the top 5 supervisory skills for effective performance. So let's start off with that, and then let's start running through those.
Okay. So when you look at the top 5 supervisory skills, and obviously there are many skills and competencies that we reinforce and recommend, but when you're looking at this demanding workplace that many of us are facing now, the top 5 skills that we've highlighted are effective communication, conflict resolution, critical thinking, time and priority management, and problem solving. So let's explore those for a bit. Effective communication. Everything, when you think about the interactions between leaders and their team members, begins and ends with communication. So how effective we are in that communication really will dictate performance outcomes in the end. And when you're faced with the demanding work environment, and oftentimes in this mode of panic, our ability to pause, reflect, and ensure that we articulate our directions and expectations becomes critical. Equally, when I think about those skills around effective communication, active listening is equally as important, because with active listening, you as a leader are attempting to truly understand what is being communicated to you, either from your senior leader articulating expectations around performance, or from your team members from the floor attempting to communicate to you potential performance or bottlenecks in process, challenges they're encountering. So active listening becomes imperative. Sean, can you share a little bit about active listening?
Yeah, that's interesting because, in the last couple of weeks, I've been having many discussions with people around effective communication and what that looks like.
Sure.
And, it's interesting. We actually just shot some videos. We do the videos on YouTube, and we actually shot some videos yesterday actually talking about effective supervisory communication. And what we really started outlining in the videos was how it's not about the message that you're delivering, but effective communication is about the people who actually receive the message, and did they really understand what you were communicating to them. So there's a couple of examples that you can use, which is ask the person to repeat what you just heard. Make sure that you're on the same playing field, you're on the same page, and you actually understand what the outcomes of what you're talking about are supposed to be. It's actually interesting that you even brought up active listening, because I always talk to clients a lot about this. There's something about hearing what someone said and active listening on what someone said. When we hear something, we tend to say, okay, yeah, we heard what you said. But then when we look at the outcomes and the results of what we expected, they're not there. When we actually have true active listening, we're looking to make sure that people are engaged with us. So here, we're talking eye to eye. I can see your eyes, you're looking at me. I can see your eyes, you're looking at me. So that way I can understand what it is that not only what I'm communicating to you, but that you have a fundamental level of understanding of of the message that you're receiving. So, when we start talking about supervisory effective communication, you have to think if I'm a frontline supervisor, it's not only one-on-one engagements that I'm encountering with every day, right? It's not just I'm talking to one person individually all the time. I find myself in huddle meetings where I could have 15 to 20 people. I find myself in production meetings, planning and scheduling meetings. As a frontline supervisor, all communication is being sourced through me. So what I end up finding out is that not only do I have to have great communication skills, I have to be very effective in the way that I communicate and articulate what are the resources I need, or what are the assignments that we need to give out to people. And that type of communication really enhances me as a frontline supervisor with the ability to make sure that what I want done, or the goals, targets that I'm trying to accomplish for the day, they're actually going to be met.
Yeah, absolutely. And oftentimes as a supervisor, our intent is positive when we are pulled by our PPE sometimes for an issue that has come up on the line, and our intent may be there to respond to that need. But if you're not actively listening, oftentimes the direction that you give in response to that issue isn't optimal for the outcomes that you're looking for, because you have not paused and verified that understanding and that expectation. So great point.
Yeah.
That leads us to conflict resolution, because that's something that we all manage, whether we're in a crisis or not. How do I address conflicts that come up in the business throughout the day, and do so in a manner that's diligent, that's responsive, and that's effective?
Yeah, and so when you start talking about conflict resolution, I mean, there's all types of conflicts that occur, right? You have process problems that occur
You bet.
that we have conflicts with. We have system errors that occur that we have conflicts with. Then we actually have, I think effective communication and conflict resolution are actually tied in directly with each other.
Absolutely.
Right? Because when you start to see effective communication break down and you start to speak in vagueness, if I said, Dante, hey, please go move this pallet over into the corner,
Right.
and I don't specifically give you specifics on which corner I want it moved in, well, I have to, you go and move the product, and maybe it's not where I wanted it, right? And so that starts to create conflict,
Sure.
right? Why didn't Dante do what I wanted him to do?
Sure.
Well, it actually comes back on my ownership, right, of the communication I gave, which was I wasn't very specific with you on exactly which corner I wanted. So when you start to talk about conflict resolution, you really have to hold the mirror in front of yourself and say, okay, did I do the right things? One, did I effectively communicate to the person or people that I needed to complete tasks, right? Two, did I give them a reasonable expectation that they would be able to meet and be able to complete and be successful, right? And three, how well did I actually follow up with those folks? Because conflict stems out of when I miss those 3 steps. When I miss those 3 steps, that's when conflict starts to merge. That's when people start to make their own decisions, right? That may not have full understanding of the path on what we're really trying to achieve. So this is always a great topic, because you start talking about conflict resolution, and really how you avoid conflict resolution is to take the personal pieces out of the conflict and really start to look at processes and how do we either improve ourselves, how do we improve our own behaviors, how do we improve the process in which we're working in, how do we improve the system in which we have to coordinate with every day to make sure that we can effectively meet targeted results every day. So when I really think about conflict resolution, I mean, that's why I say those two tie in so systematically together.
Absolutely. And to your point, that also is a requirement between 2 peers, right? Not necessarily between supervisor and employee. That same approach around validating the breakdown in communication processes exists between peers working side by side as well. So as a supervisor, if you encounter conflict between 2 peers, foster that clarity. Typically, it's a result of a breakdown in understanding between 2 individuals. So if you can foster that clarity and understanding, active listening between those 2 folks, those same principles apply, and you helping to help others resolve conflicts that they're encountering, especially in these times where anxieties and tensions are up. So great point there. That brings us to this notion of critical thought.
Yeah.
To what extent does a leader have to critically think about the challenges, the barriers, the problems that they're encountering every day to be effective as a supervisor?
Yeah, critical thinking, some people refer to it as just getting to the details, right? Understanding what the details are. Because when you're critical thinking, you're trying to understand every aspect, every detail of what's happening around you, and then trying to make the most effective decision that you can, right? What I love about the top 5 supervisory skills that they all mesh together, right?
Absolutely.
So, I mean, you start talking about, again, the first topic of effective communication. 2, you start talking about conflict resolution. 3, you start talking about critical thinking, which is when you talk about critical thinking as a frontline supervisor, I may have control of one area, right? And what is my job as a frontline supervisor is to maximize the output, throughput, and control my cost with the safety of my employees, right? And so while I'm making those decisions, I may not be inherent to what is happening upstream for me or what's happening downstream for me. So as I'm working in my area, I may be maximizing my output, but when you start talking about effective communication, conflict resolution, and critical thinking, what am I really doing to everything around me that surrounds me, right? So, conflict can be stemmed up because, hey, Dante, you're doing a great job. You're pumping out 150 units, but downstream from you, I can only do 100 units, right? So we start to get conflict with each other, nonverbal conflict that's actually happening between departments, because you don't understand what's happening to me, and I'm not effectively communicating back to you what actually needs to flow through the system so we can both be effective together, right? So when I think about those critical thinking skills, you have that piece, and then you have how do I actually go out and root cause and diagnose problems that are happening out on the floor, which is a whole and different entire skill of itself, which is how do I actually go out to the floor, understand in my area what are the true barriers that are preventing me from being successful every day. Okay, and that's diagnostic skills take practice. It's just not inherent. People just aren't born with it. It takes practice and repetition to be able to go out to the floor, understand the details. When you say critical, what are the details of what are happening inside my process, and how do I actually get to those root causes?
So it sounds to me that critical thinking becomes a skill that enables an employee both in scenarios of proactive execution and in some cases reacting to issues or problems that pop up. Without critical thought, you may not reach the point of root cause of those challenges or issues, thus creating this revolving door of issues that keep recurring.
Oh yeah.
So, this is of the top 5 skills for supervisors. Time and priority management is a big one, right? That comes up very often in the scope of our work with our frontline leaders. And oftentimes we hear it in the construct of, I am being asked to do more than what I can in the time frame that's allotted to me. And how, as a supervisor, am I supposed to get all this done when my manager's saying, look, I don't know what you got to do, you just got to get it done?
Yeah, so it's interesting because as I'm a frontline supervisor and I get hired on, right? My job is to effectively hit the targeted goals, capacities, whatever that performance criteria is that I'm supposed to hit. That is my job. So as a frontline supervisor, my job is to come in and build a management operating system that is going to not only allow myself or maybe my manager, but my people to be successful out on the floor. Okay. It's interesting when you start talking about time and priority management, because what we talk about with frontline supervisors is how do we start to build those supervisory routines? How do we start to embed the routine on when we get in at 4 in the morning and we have to start this plan up, or if I have to come into the office at 8 a.m., starting at 8 a.m., what's that going to look like on a daily basis? How am I going to get into a disciplined regiment that's going to allow myself and my team to be successful every day? So really what you want to do is you want to start mapping out, and you can take a blank sheet of paper out, right? Just start writing the times out. I always say, put your meetings down first, right? After you put your meetings down, make sure that those are value-added meetings and they're just not time consumers for you, right?
That's right.
Because if you're not actively participating in a meeting, you probably shouldn't be in the meeting.
You bet.
Okay, because your job is to add value into that meeting. If you're attending a meeting and you don't say anything, and you see yourself going 5-6 times to this meeting and you never say anything, you probably don't need to be there. Okay, because the value in which you bring is not needed for that particular meeting. Maybe it's needed somewhere else.
Sure, sure.
So you really start to build these routines that will allow us to outline our days every single day so we can show up and be very regimented on what we do. So how are we going to follow up with people? How are we going to communicate with people? What meetings are we going to consume our time with? When our time isn't being consumed by those things, how are we going to apply the rest of our time? Is it going to be quality of product? Is it going to be process checks? Is it going to be engagement out on the floor? Are we going to do safety check? Start to build that out. So that way, when you have that conflict of management, a barrier that you see is that people that don't have daily routines structured out, they think you have more time than what you really do have.
Absolutely.
Right. And so what they're trying to do is give assignments that will fill and occupy that time. As a frontline supervisor, I need to present out to be successful in my area, my department, wherever my state of control is. This is what I've got to do. This is what I've got to build. And this is how I have to effectively manage the area every day.
Makes sense. And when we think about this notion of building out our standard routines, part of that requires you as a frontline supervisor to collaborate with your manager if you're not sure what is truly a priority. And later on in our discussion, we'll talk about understanding what's important and urgent in the business, because those are the things that I may prioritize over things that are less important or not urgent to achieving my performance results. So we'll explore that a bit more later. That brings us to our final top 5 supervisory skill, and that is problem solving. And you'll start to see the connection, if you haven't already, between communication, conflict resolution, critical thought, time and priority management. All of that sort of fuels problem solving efforts, right?
Yeah, it does. You know, it all does help with the problem solving. It helps you start to alleviate your problems a little bit better than what they were before. Okay. But when you really start talking about true problem solving skills, frontline supervisors that I work with, what you end up finding out is they take it all on themselves, right? They'll go, oh, a problem has occurred. I need to define that problem, go out there, try to solve it myself, whether it even includes areas of control that I'm not responsible for, right?
Sure.
What frontline supervisors really have to remember is that when you go into problem solving skills, is that it is your job to find the resources needed to eliminate the barrier. Okay, so that I need help from someone above me, right? I always use a lot of terms in manufacturing because that's where my sweet spot is, right? So, but you know, if I have a general manager, the general manager's responsibility is to provide me the resources that I need to be successful, right? As a supervisor, my job is to identify the problem and use those resources I have available to me to make that barrier disappear. Okay, so when you start talking about problem solving, first as a supervisor, I have to understand what's available to me, and understanding that problem solving is just not completely on the sole ownership of myself. I may need other parties to help me out. So I have to start to create action plans, action item logs. They'll help me bring other resources in to help me facilitate that. The second piece of problem solving is, now that I have those resources, it is my job as a frontline supervisor to make sure that those are executed correctly. It's not me to just go, hey, Dante, you're in a different department. I really needed you to do this. You didn't do it. My job is to follow up with you and say, hey, Dante, this is why it's imperative. This is what it means to us as an organization, as a business. And since I am the one that all the costs are controlled through, you're my outside resource that I need you to help me pull this together. Okay.
And I love that point that you raised, because that really begins to connect some of the other principles that we're exploring today. When you think about not only the top 5 supervisory skills, right, communication, conflict resolution, critical thinking, time and priority management, and problem solving, but what we also begin to get into is this notion of ownership and accountability. How do I foster that for myself and my teams? Because problems, I either see them as something that I need to take on or something that's not my responsibility, right? How do we distinguish that? And I think it begins with clarifying ownership and accountability and really knowing the difference. Oftentimes, the terms ownership and accountability are used interchangeably.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they're really not, right? Ownership really is about the freedom for employees to deliver results. And we'll talk about what we mean by freedom, right? And signs that you truly own something is taking that initiative and responsibility for tasks and outcomes. That's real ownership, seizing those opportunities to bring those ideas forward. Whereas accountability now that I own it, right? That is about following through and delivering everything that I believe I own, right? And I think that distinction becomes important because how you know you have accountability really begins with accepting and reporting on outcomes, and particularly without blaming others. That's true accountability. So we're going to explore that a bit because that's an important distinction as a supervisor. How do we establish that ownership and accountability? Where does it start?
Yeah, as a frontline supervisor, I think ownership and accountability starts with myself, right? And again, it's the holding the mirror up to myself. What is my area? What is my performance structure? The first part of understanding that is I have to know what it is I'm supposed to complete every day, or what is my targeted goals, or the outcomes I'm supposed to deliver for the organization.
Sure.
If I don't understand that, it really starts to come down to the roles and responsibilities that I have in the business, right? So as a frontline supervisor, I would typically walk in and there's probably already a platform set up for me. There's probably metrics that already exist.
Sure.
There's probably measurements that sit there that I can go and evaluate and see how well my area is doing, right? That's usually, as a frontline supervisor, when we start to talk about the steps of ownership and accountability, I need to learn my area first, okay? We have a process inside our business. It's called 15 steps of area development, right? And we walk people through that systematically so that they, as a frontline supervisor, I understand capacity, I understand resource constraints, I understand the people I have, the skill levels that they have, I understand the overtime, the turnover, I understand the cost structure of my area that's coming in, right?
Sure.
I understand the inputs, the outputs. There's so much as a frontline supervisor that I have to understand and know. So making sure that we understand our area when we first walk in the door is very imperative. Second piece is understanding is, since now that I know all that, what are the reporting structures and systems that are available to me that are going to give me what I need to understand about my business? Are there things that allow me to trend downtime? Are there opportunities or systems that allow me to understand productivity rates, labor rates, costs? And I need to go use my resources. Maybe that's in accounting, maybe that's in planning and scheduling, but I need to start to pull these people together so I can start to understand wholly as a system what is going to be in my control. Because if I don't know what's in my control, I can't own it, and I sure can't be accountable for it.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I hear you say, okay, right, we have the platform for reporting on outcomes. If I don't have a mechanism to understand how I'm performing and reporting on it to others, then I'm going to struggle with feeling a sense of ownership and accountability. I know my role, and that's where we get into coming out of our last webinar, part one, where we talked about that distinction between what I'm accountable for versus what I'm responsible for, hence defining or clarifying roles and responsibilities. And then you made reference to this notion that I have to have some measure of decision-making authority. Otherwise, I can't truly own it. I want to be able to make decisions surrounding the resources, the investment, and personnel, time, or what have you, to realize those outcomes. Now, what about this notion of supporting innovative thought and resourcefulness? Why is that so important?
Well, I think, when you start, when you start moving up, the staircase to how you get to ownership and accountability, there's a couple things that you need to do to get to that point where you start talking about innovative, resourceful thinking. I mean, first of all, we talked about how we come through and we have our reporting platforms. Now, as a frontline supervisor, I have to understand what are my true roles and responsibilities of my position, right? And meaning that I was hired on as a frontline supervisor, right? Now, what is my area that I'm over? Okay. What are the controls that I have? Okay. So now I'm starting to understand what are my roles and responsibilities. Now, in my responsibilities case as well, how do I report those back up? What are the metrics that I'm going to use to report that? How am I going to effectively communicate throughout the organization, my initiatives? So when you start talking about innovative thinking, I think that's really the ladder in which frontline supervisors start to move up, right? And what is going to be the conduit for them to start to talk about initiatives that they can take within their own areas and departments to make improvements. You know, you can't walk in day one and just go, oh, we need to make this improvement.
Sure.
Right? You have to understand the area that you have first before you can take that next step. Okay. And typically that, you know, a frontline supervisor should be going to an area and within the first 3 months, you know, at least understanding the dynamics of their area, right? They should be able to start to make those problem solving areas identified where they can go, okay, this is an issue that we need to take care of. This will allow us to reduce cost by maybe a cent, maybe 2 cents, maybe if it's measured in dollars, or maybe it's just a strict performance number. Maybe I process client claims or transactions faster. Okay. And then that gets to the point where you start to move them through giving them the opportunity to start to make decisions.
Yes.
Right. That's why I go back into our, you know, when we were talking last week in our video, you know, when I take control of the area, if you report to me and I come in and take control of your area, I have now owned the area. You no longer own it.
Sure.
Right. And because I've taken, because I haven't given you the ability to make the decisions that you need to make on the floor and trust that you're going to make the right decisions, right? Or you're going to at least, I'm going to trust that at least you've used the information that's made available to you to make the right decision, okay? So when you start talking about that, you know, decision-making piece, as frontline supervisors have growth inside the business, you know, there's a point where you start to go, okay, now they can start making their own decisions, right? And once you do that, that's the point where I get to hold them accountable.
Sure.
Okay. Now that you have decision making in your area and you have the responsibility of it, I can now hold you accountable for it because you know what reporting platforms that you have. You understand the data coming in, coming out. You understand the processes. You understand the 15 steps of area development inside your area. You clearly understand your role and responsibility. So
Sure.
now that we have those, call it the checklist, now we have those two checked off. Now I have the ability to give you decision-making authority, and I can actually hold you accountable to your area's performance.
Sure. And when I think about all of those principles you shared, as a supervisor attempting to foster that same culture of ownership and accountability at the front line, these principles don't change. When you think about creating a platform for reporting outcomes at a frontline level, it may not be in a production meeting, but it may be at a morning huddle when you're reflecting on the performance of the prior shift or the prior day. When you're celebrating the outcomes of that frontline employee's performance or what they did special or different. When you ask them to call out what made a difference in today's performance versus yesterday's performance, great job, or we struggled team, all those become a form of reporting of outcomes at the front line. Work your way up to clarifying roles and responsibilities. If I'm working a line next to someone, I need to understand the function of my role and the impact that that has on the outcomes, right? It's the same principles of clarifying for the frontline employee, this is what you do, and you package at this rate, and you do so in a manner that supports the person in front of the line. And clarifying those roles also begins to foster that at the front line. Same thing with decision-making authority. It looks different at the front line. Maybe it's a platform by which they can suggest improvements to process because they're on the line, they're experiencing it for themselves. Maybe it's a suggestion or an idea box that you put out on the production floor in a safe area where they can make suggestions confidentially about a process. Guess what that does? It creates this notion of I can influence my environment in my area. That begins to foster that sense of ownership at the front line. Equally, when we think about innovative and resourceful thinking, it's the same premise. If my frontline employee, who may not understand all of the details behind the scenes, comes to me and says, Sean, I have a really great idea about how we can pick up our rate by 1 unit per minute or 2 units per minute, and it involves X, Y, and Z. The worst thing you can do as a supervisor is to dismiss that innovation or creative thought. You want to encourage it, even if it doesn't result in a truly implemented process. It encourages them to continue to explore ways that they can continuously improve at their level, right? So those same principles that we're talking about really is transferable at every level of the organization, which is what you want to foster as part of that culture of ownership and accountability. And that's what really makes us excited about these, right?
Yeah. So when, really when you talk about ownership and accountability, I always say you're trying to separate the they, right? They won't allow me to do this. They won't allow me to move the product. They won't allow me to adjust the equipment. Well, what frontline supervisors have to understand is that they are they.
Yeah.
They are they. Okay.
Right.
So they are responsible for the decisions on that line, because as a general manager in the plant, I'm looking to my frontline supervisors to make the right decisions that are going to give us the best outcomes.
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
And so when you start to inhibit people from using that innovative critical thinking, or saying, hey, that won't work, that won't happen, what ends up happening, you start to foster this culture, right? You start to foster this culture that goes, well, they don't see the importance of it. They don't think it will work. They don't.
That's
so
right.
You have to remember, as a frontline supervisor, or somebody who manages frontline supervisors, that there's no bad ideas. Okay, there are no bad ideas. Sometimes those ideas have to be prioritized. Okay, we can't just do everything that we want to do.
Absolutely.
Sometimes there's a cost structure that comes with it, and you have
Absolutely.
to understand that. But what we do have to allow them to do is come up with innovative ideas that are going to help impact their area. And how do we start to build on that?
That's right.
Because a frontline supervisor, I may not understand what's happening, all the full details that are happening throughout my supply chain, right? But if I start to group these people together and I start to ask for help from the resources that are made available to me, I can really start to make a change inside my area.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and as a general manager or someone who has frontline supervisors reporting to them, I need to make sure that I foster that, but we remove the they, right? Meaning that frontline supervisors are managers. They are supervisors of people. Okay.
Right.
And since they do supervise people, they are they. And the decisions that we make collectively as a group together allow us to get the biggest impacts.
And this notion of transitioning from the they mentality to the we mentality really brings us to our topic around a culture of blame versus a culture of accountability. Because oftentimes in organizations, as we're working to develop frontline leaders, what we find is there's this culture of blame that exists. And to your point, there's this notion of every time something happens that goes wrong, the finger pointing begins.
Oh yeah, you're using my manufacturing coat of arms.
That's right.
It's the manufacturing coat of arms.
It's maintenance's problem. It's production's problem. You know what? It's HR's problem.
It's a good shield.
That's right.
Good shield.
That's right. So when you think about that in context of what we're sharing, how do you begin to make that distinction between, do I contribute to a culture of blame or a culture of accountability? And what we've outlined for you and we want to take you through is some of those distinctions. And it begins with your belief system, because it starts there, especially when you think about leadership, competency, and culture. Your belief system, if you're in a culture of blame, you tend to point at the people as a problem, as opposed to the people being problem solvers. And you alluded to that, right? The minute we see problems as a result of an individual versus a process breakdown or a communication breakdown, we tend to foster a culture of blame. Equally, when you see people as the headache, oh goodness, here's Sean again, bringing this issue to me, that begins to foster this culture of blame. And it's subtle. Same thing with admitting or believing that your weaknesses are career limiting. How many times have we sat and have been afraid to speak up about a barrier or an issue because of what it may mean as a reflection of us and our performance? That tends to lean toward a culture of blame versus ushering in this thought process or belief system that, you know what, this is a continuous learning environment. We are fostering continuous improvement, which means anytime I encounter a barrier or anytime my team encounters a barrier, I want to face it head on, right? Those are two different cultures. What have you seen?
So I want to take on your example where, you have the employee that comes up and he goes, oh, he's bringing me another problem. Well, he's bringing you a problem because it is a problem.
Bingo.
You know, and as a frontline supervisor, my job is not to warrant or push aside the barrier that's being brought to me. My job as a frontline supervisor is to understand the details of that problem and how do I remove those barriers.
That's right.
And those come in different ways as a frontline supervisor, right?
Sure.
Those come from not only process issues, those come from personnel issues, right? So as a frontline supervisor, I have to manage not only the behaviors of my folks that I'm looking for, I have to manage the processes as well. So as I step out onto the floor, I step out there with my team, how you get rid of the blame and the they is that I have to really understand that everybody that brings me a problem is a true problem. Okay. Now the size of that problem, is it an anthill? Is it a glacier? I don't know what that is, but my job as a frontline supervisor is to get down to the bottom of it and mitigate it as much as I can.
Sure.
And provide feedback. So we always talk about feedback loops, right? Just don't do things in a vacuum. Make sure you get feedback so people know what you completed or what you weren't able to and what you're doing next.
Sure.
So you still have to have that feedback loop, whether it's process related or personnel related, right? Because people want to understand that you care about them, right? You care that they showed up every day. And that's what we want for our people. We want them to show up every day. And care is just as much about the business as that we care about the business. Okay?
Sure.
So this is always a great topic for me because I'm always like, people want to show up and know that they have ownership of something, that they can make decisions, that they own it. And even in the field with our guys, I've always told my project managers, I'm not going to manage the project for you.
That's right.
You make the decisions, right? But I will hold you accountable to the decisions that you make.
Sure.
Okay. So when you start talking about blame, you really start saying, hey guys, instead of us trying to blame people, let's not blame people. Let's actually look at what we are being told, how that information is being drawn up to us, and let's actually go out there and effectively understand what are we going to do to start removing the barriers, whether how small or how large that they are.
So to your point, that brings you back to what we discussed earlier about those fundamental supervisory skills, because what you are articulating requires problem solving, communication, conflict resolution.
Absolutely.
So you start to make those connections. So you may ask, okay, so as a supervisor or manager in my organization, what do I need to focus on to ensure I don't foster this culture of blame, right? You should be focusing on what's wrong. Focus on the problem, to your point. Focus on fact finding, exploring root cause. Focus on the future state. Where do I want to be and how do I get there? And that includes leveraging the resources around me. Focus on improving those results, right? So that's where we get into what is my variance? What are the actions I need to take in order to close that gap, right? And that results in some behaviors. Considering alternatives, delegating and decision-making authority. You start to see those connections when you have this culture of accountability as opposed to a culture of blame. So really explore that in your operation and how are you fostering that? When we think about this culture of accountability, and I've made reference to this notion of collaboration and leveraging the resources around us, I'm thinking about organizations who value a team-centric culture, especially in our client organizations where working together as a team in a collaborative manner is imperative to business success. And how do we do so in the midst of the Corona era when we have so much social distancing going on, we have isolation protocols? How do we begin to foster that or maintain that team-centric culture despite what's going on around us?
Yeah, I think about this a lot because I think, even with social distancing, when you start to really talk about how you foster those teams, right? So, coaches can, hold players accountable if you think about the sports world, right? But then, the real great teams, it's because players hold players accountable, right? So, when you start talking about execution of work, even with the social distancing, with the mainstream that's going on, that we need to be apart, that, we can't collectively collaborate together, that's not really true. Okay, because we can still collaborate. We can still talk about the initiatives that need to take place to meet our productivity demands, meet our cost targets. We can still do those things. What it really drives down to is execution of work. I have to now rely on you more than anybody, that you're going to be able to execute and do the things that you say you're going to do. Okay, so when you start talking about culture and values, now my trust, right, our people, how we integrate those folks in with that. So now I have to take a higher level of trust in you, knowing that once you told me you said you were going to do something, that you are going to do it. And it has to drive us together that, okay, we can, even though with, the Corona era and, we've got these obstacles in our way, that we can still effectively get work done the way that we need to.
Absolutely. So when you think about team-centric culture, just keep a focus on mechanisms to maintain communication, support, and encouragement. We provided some just quick tips on how to maintain those in despite of social distancing, right? Leveraging the tools around you, encouraging creativity in terms of work execution, and really encouraging people to collaborate to the best of their abilities in the midst of what's going on around them. So we want to just focus quickly on this notion of urgency and tenacity in our supervisory realm, because oftentimes in the midst of a trying environment, there's this desire to maintain a sense of urgency because we're responding to changes in demand. And what we've provided is just the key to know, how do I judge what's important and where I should be most tenacious and urgent in my actions versus those things that may not be. So Sean, you want to quickly just go through these?
Yeah, let's actually talk about these. So, there's pretty much 4 steps that you can do: manage, focus, avoid, and limit. Okay. So when we start talking about, what's urgent, how are we going to, when we start talking about crisis and how we're going to present problems, what the demand and necessity, daily and firefighting, be quick to delegate. When we start talking about that, that really comes to my own supervisory management style, right? And that's where we even talk about in our videos around proactive versus reactive management style.
Sure.
Now, today, more than ever, I have to have a proactive management style that is going to drive me to the floor, drive me into my area or department that I manage, and understand the system elements that I need to control on a daily basis. I'm no longer going to be able to sit in the back and just watch it happen and hope that maybe my lead or an operator, my best operator, is going to be able to function for the day, right? There's so much coming at me so quickly and at my employees, that I've got to get out there and I've got to make sure I'm helping them to support them.
So the things that are important and urgent require me to actively manage them, ideally proactively manage them. But even in times of crises and pressing situations, I want to focus on what is the demand, what's the necessity. Now, there's ideally scenarios where it's important but not urgent. I don't have to place as much urgency on the things that require more foresight, things that are strategic in nature, that require me to focus on more of the values of the business, right? The things that are future state, opportunities that may present themselves, planning in terms of work execution, the things that require more critical thought. Ideally, you're always going to focus on category 1 and category 2. Those things are where you're going to put most of your energy and are typically value added. Categories 3 and 4, you want to either avoid or limit. Those are things that either create interruptions in your ability to execute on the more value added task, or things that are frankly trivial and wasteful. And we talked about that in our first webinar, how to distinguish between value add, non-value add, and typically the things that are non-value added are affiliated with your 8 categories of waste, or as we refer to as
10
woods, right? So the idea is know what's urgent, distinguish between what's important versus what's not important, what's urgent and what's not urgent. And what that enables you to do is then apply some of these best practices to foster that, right? And we'll go quickly in essence of time, but think about the proportion or act in proportion to the urgency. Just because we're in a mode of crisis doesn't mean that we have to have our hair on fire. Assess if it's important and urgent and then respond accordingly. Also, specify the task to reduce confusion and improve judgment surrounding the matter or the issue. That also includes if things are being passed down to you as a supervisor from your leader. If they are presenting to you something that you believe requires urgency and importance, clarify it, because it may not be as urgent as you perceive it, especially if they didn't act in proportion to the urgency. Also, clarify the consequences. By doing so, you will foster someone's disposition toward what you've requested. If what I ask you to do will impact our customers' fulfillment of their order today, and I need you to respond to it, I'm gonna make sure you're clear on that so that you put more urgency behind that than something that may not have as grave of an impact if you delay it for a later period of time. So clarify the consequences, set the conditions, and more importantly, recognize those who are exhibiting the sense of urgency and tenacity that you're looking for.
Yeah, so I'm gonna say one thing, and I think I'll close this out.
Sure.
Okay, which is, if I'm a frontline supervisor out there today, with the sense of urgency that's out there, on a daily basis, what I would do, okay, some advice, what I would do is write down what the activities are that I want to have completed every day, go to my manager, show them what I want to complete, okay, and how I want to affect the business, have them help me set those priorities, and then that way I know that we're tracking on the same path.
That's right.
Okay? So thank you again, Dante, really appreciate it. We thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in part 3 of our webinar series. Have a great day.